White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is in Israel today. He met with Israeli President Herzog earlier today to discuss the next phase of Israel's war with Hamas. U.S. officials, meanwhile, are now pushing back on reports that Sullivan told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the, quote, high-intensity phase of the war in Gaza needs to end within weeks and not months. During a meeting with him yesterday, the officials told Fox News that Sullivan did not attach a specific timeline to his conversations. A top Hamas official is also reportedly calling for violent attacks against Americans and threatening Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Joining me right now is former National Security Council, State Department, and United Nations official, One Shared World founder, and the author of Hacking Darwin, Jamie Metzl, back with us. Jamie, it's great to see you. Welcome back. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure, as always, Maria.
Well, you're also a former WHO expert committee member, so I want to get to the World Health Organization issues as well. But first, give us your take here. I'm wondering why the United States is telling Israel how to deal with its issues and how to deal with this war after Israel was attacked in an unprovoked attack from Hamas terrorists.
Well, I agree with you, Maria. Obviously, the attacks on October 7th were absolutely horrific. Israel, like any other country, is working to neutralize its enemies who are committed by their charter, essentially, to committing genocide. So everybody, at least everyone in the White House and elsewhere, recognizes Israel's absolute right to fully neutralize Hamas. What we're seeing, though, is in the United States, there is some pressure on the Biden administration to try to at least be seen as minimizing civilian casualties as much as possible. And I think the Israelis are trying to do that as much as possible. The problem is that Hamas, it's not that they don't care about Palestinian civilian casualties. It's that Palestinian civilian casualties are part of their strategy. So Israel needs to keep pushing, but it needs to do that in the most careful way possible, which is very, very difficult. And I do think that the Biden administration, I know that they're saying that the time frame can't be dictated by America, and that's absolutely the case. But the Israelis recognize that there needs to be a more intense phase and a more targeted phase. And it's ultimately up to the Israelis to make that decision. But I think it's legitimate for the United States to privately and sometimes even publicly express its views, because the United States, of course, is a very important backer of Israel.
I'm just wondering if this is all about the election. They want this war to end. They want Israel to stop and back down because it's an election year.
I don't know whether that's the case. The United States has very many interests around the globe, and the United States absolutely has Israel's back and has had Israel's back, certainly since October 7th. But the United States is trying to balance a lot of things. It's trying to maintain the Abraham Accords, which is also in Israel's interest. The U.S. has significant military assets in the region and needs to be pushing back against Iran. So I think Jake Sullivan, who's now in the Middle East, is trying to balance a lot of different things. But the United States has been pretty clear that we do have Israel's back.
But, Jamie, the White House is remaining silent this morning after dozens of reported Biden administration staffers protested the president's Israel policy earlier this week. They're calling for the ceasefire in Gaza. Some of the protesters were wearing masks, hats, and sunglasses to hide their faces. You posted about this protest on X, and you wrote this: these staffers from the Biden White House should have expressed their dissent internally, or they should have resigned. Having done neither and choosing this course, they should be fired. Jamie, tell us more about this.
Well, Maria, as you mentioned, I'm a former National Security Council official during the Clinton administration. And in the United States government, we have very strong provisions for expressing dissent internally. They come from the Vietnam War era, where we had these kinds of problems. And so certainly these staffers could have expressed their displeasure internally. They also could have resigned, like many courageous National Security Council and other officials did after January 6th. Matt Pottinger and others quit the NSC in the Trump administration because they didn't stand behind what President Trump was saying on January 6th. So these people could have resigned. by going out and protesting in front of the White House. They were doing neither. And I think it makes them a security risk, because if you have people who are not resigning and not internally expressing their dissent, but publicly protesting against their boss, how could we possibly trust these people to implement the policies of the President of the United States and the American electorate? That's why I believe they should be fired.
Yeah, great. Really well said. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, meanwhile, is outlining her 2024 China strategy. She gave a speech at a U.S.-China Business Council dinner last night, which included a second planned trip to China. Yellen also slammed Trump-era China policies during her speech. Here's a bit of that. I want to get your reaction. Watch.
When President Biden took office, considerable work was needed both domestically and internationally. The Trump administration had failed to make investments at home in critical areas like infrastructure and advanced technology, while also neglecting relationships with our partners and allies that had been forged and strengthened over decades. This left America more vulnerable and more isolated in a competitive global economy. It damaged our global standing and meant significant missed economic opportunities for American firms and workers.
So, Jamie, what's your reaction? What are we supposed to do? Not respond at all to China's aggression, a surveillance balloon traveling across our country, years and years of intellectual property theft, a cover-up of COVID? That's just a small amount of a long list of aggression from China on Joe Biden's watch.
I believe that every American presidential administration, at least since the Clinton administration and probably even before, hasn't been tough enough on China. We have essentially tried to welcome China into the international community. We've welcomed China into the WTO. And at pretty much every step, China has abused those overtures and played the international system for its own benefit and against us. So every administration has been too weak on China. I do agree with her that the Trump administration undermined America's alliance relationships, because that's one of the elements of strength. I certainly also believe that every administration, Trump, Biden, everybody else, should have been much tougher, because when you look at what China has done and is doing now, it's absolutely outrageous. Aggression in the South China Sea, aggression against Taiwan, COVID origins, preventing any kind of meaningful investigation, massive intellectual property theft beyond anything ever seen in history. And China is aggressively preparing for a war with us. So it is insane for us to not be tougher, and it's appropriate and positive that there is in the U.S. House of Representatives, the China Committee, chaired and co-chaired by Representatives Gallagher, Republican, and Krishnamurti, Democrat, who've laid out a plan for being much more aggressive on China. And we have to be, because we don't want to live in a world based upon the principles that China is promoting.
Yeah, I mean, look, at this point, you have to believe that Trump was the toughest. You may not think it was tough enough, but he put all those tariffs on China